The little black girl begged the biker, saying a torn piece of her mom's coat was found beside a restricted vat. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The roar of the motorcycles filled the night air as the iron riders sped through the dark streets, their headlights cutting through the misty fog that clung to the asphalt. The little girl, her face pale from fear and exhaustion, sat behind Jake, clutching his leather vest with trembling hands. The promise of safety seemed distant, but Jake knew they couldn't waste any more time. The restricted vat was just ahead, a place that had long been off-limits to everyone, a place full of secrets and danger. As they approached the outskirts of town, the air grew colder, and the once bustling streets became eerily quiet. They passed the old factory, its broken windows casting long shadows across the ground, and in the distance, the restricted vat loomed like a silent sentinel, warning them to stay away. But Jake wasn't about to turn back. Not now. The girl's story was burning in his mind. Her mother's coat, torn and abandoned near the vat, could mean only one thing. Something sinister was happening here, and they were going to get to the bottom of it. The bikers didn't say much as they neared the vat. They were used to danger, used to fighting for justice, but this felt different. There was something in the air tonight, an unsettling feeling that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. They parked their bikes in a narrow alleyway just a few hundred yards from the vat. The dim light from the street lamps barely illuminated the path ahead, and the sound of their engines slowly faded as the night swallowed them whole. "Stay close, everyone," Jake ordered, his voice low and steady. The group nodded, their faces grim, their hands already gripping the handles of their weapons. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they were prepared for anything. The girl, still clinging to Jake's side, looked up at him with wide eyes. "What if we don't find my mom?" she whispered, her voice quivering with fear. Jake bent down, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We will. I promise you, we'll find her." His words were meant to reassure her, but even he wasn't sure what they were about to uncover. They made their way down a narrow, dirt-covered path that led toward the vat. The ground was uneven, and branches scraped against their jackets as they moved through the dense underbrush. Every footstep felt like it was echoing in the silence, but no one dared to speak. They were all too focused on the task at hand, the feeling of danger growing stronger with every step. As they neared the vat, they saw a group of figures standing in the shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness. Jake signaled for the bikers to spread out, and they silently moved into position, surrounding the area. The figures in the shadows didn't seem to notice them at first. They were focused on something else, something they didn't want anyone to see. Jake's heart raced as he caught sight of the large metal structure looming in front of him. The restricted vat. It looked old and rusted, its steel walls covered in grime and decay. A faint smell of chemicals and something far worse lingered in the air. As the group advanced cautiously, one of the figures in the shadows stepped forward, revealing himself to be a tall, imposing man with a cold, hard look in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" he growled, his voice low and threatening. Jake stood tall, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. "We're here for the girl's mother." "Where is she?" The man sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Without warning, the man lunged forward, and the group of bikers quickly reacted, pulling out their weapons and moving into defensive positions. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the tension in the air escalated. He knew they were about to face a fight, but he wasn't going to back down. Not for the girl. Not for the promise he had made to her father years ago. "Get ready," Jake muttered, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. The rest of the group shifted into position, their muscles tense and their eyes sharp. This was it. They were about to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The fight for the girl's mother was about to begin. The tension was thick in the air as the man in front of Jake and the bikers squared up, his face contorted with anger. The rest of the group stood at the ready, weapons in hand, eyes locked on the figure before them. Jake's grip tightened around the handle of his knife, But he wasn't ready to strike just yet. He had to know more, had to understand who this man was and what was really going on at the restricted vat. Where's the girl's mother? Jake's voice cut through the stillness, calm but full of authority. The man sneered, taking a step forward. You don't want to know, he said with a low, dangerous growl. This is bigger than you. Jake's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. He had heard this kind of talk before, threats meant to intimidate. But Jake wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. We'll decide what we want to know, he said, his voice unwavering. The man stopped, clearly calculating whether to back down or go further. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound the soft hum of the night breeze. Then, without warning, the man lunged at Jake, his fist aimed straight for his face. Jake ducked just in time, spinning around and catching the man off guard. A quick twist of his body, and he was on the offensive, pushing the man to the ground with a force that sent a cloud of dust into the air. The rest of the bikers moved quickly, closing in around the man as they readied themselves for whatever came next. But the man wasn't alone. From the shadows, two more figures emerged, their faces masked, their bodies hidden under dark clothing. The bikers reacted instantly, stepping forward to defend their position. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area, realizing this wasn't just some random thug. These people were organized. They had a purpose, and they weren't going to stop easily. Stay on guard, Jake shouted to the group. They're not alone. The man on the ground growled, his hands reaching for something hidden under his jacket. Jake stepped forward, slamming his boot into the man's wrist, forcing him to drop whatever weapon he was reaching for. Not today, Jake muttered under his breath. But even as the man was subdued, the situation grew worse. The second figure, a woman with short, sharp features, took a step forward, her eyes glinting with malice. You think you can just waltz in here and take what's ours? She sneered. You have no idea what you're up against. Jake's brow furrowed, but he kept his voice steady. We're not leaving without her. Now tell me where she is. The woman's smile was cold, almost predatory. You'll never find her. You're already too late. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew they were running out of time, but he wasn't about to let fear take over. He had made a promise, and that promise would not go unfulfilled. Then we'll just have to make sure we're not too late, he said, his voice steely. Without hesitation, he signaled to the rest of the bikers. They advanced, spreading out to surround the woman and the man on the ground. You're surrounded, Jake said, his tone full of authority. Tell us where she is. The woman laughed, a hollow, empty sound that echoed through the night. You'll never stop what's coming. No one will. Jake's eyes burned with determination. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. If you won't tell us, we'll find her ourselves, he said, nodding to his crew. With that, the bikers moved in, their movements sharp and precise. The woman glared at them, but her resistance was futile. They had her surrounded, and there was nowhere for her to go. She cursed under her breath, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes now. She was beginning to realize just how serious this was, just how far Jake and the bikers were willing to go to protect the little girl and her mother. As the bikers continued their search, they came to a small, decrepit building near the vat. The smell of chemicals was stronger here, thick and heavy in the air. Jake's instincts told him they were getting close. He motioned for the bikers to halt, then crept forward, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Inside, they found a series of locked doors and a faint light flickering from under one of them. Jake's heart raced as he approached, his hand resting on the cold metal. He looked back at the group, his jaw set. This is it. She's in there. With a single motion, Jake kicked the door open, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the room. The flickering light revealed a small room, barely furnished, with a single figure lying unconscious on the floor. It was her, the little girl's mother. But she was far from safe. Jake rushed to her side, checking her pulse. She was alive, but just barely. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow, and there was an unsettling bruise on the side of her head. She had clearly been through hell. The bikers gathered around, their expressions grim. They had found her, but they knew this was only the beginning. Whoever was behind this was not going to let them walk away easily. The danger was far from over, but Jake wasn't about to let this woman, or the girl who had led them here, down. The room was thick with tension as Jake knelt beside the unconscious woman, her frail body barely moving beneath him. His hand hovered over her wrist, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but there. She was alive, but barely. The bikers gathered around, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of more danger. The smell of chemicals hung heavily in the air, and the dim light flickered above them, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "She's alive," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "But we need to get her out of here, fast." He motioned for one of the bikers, a tall man named Diesel, to help lift the woman. "We've got to move. The longer we stay here, the more likely they'll come after us." Diesel nodded, carefully picking the woman up as Jake led the way. The rest of the bikers followed closely behind, their senses on high alert as they made their way out of the cramped room. As they moved down the narrow hallway toward the exit, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the building. The sound of heavy footsteps followed, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. "They're here," he muttered under his breath. The bikers immediately dropped into defensive positions, their hands on their weapons. Jake's mind raced. He knew they had to make it out of the building before reinforcements arrived, but the narrow hallways and lack of exits made it nearly impossible. He could hear the distant voices of men shouting and the sound of boots pounding against the concrete. "We need to hurry," Jake said, his voice urgent. "They know we're here, and they'll stop at nothing to keep us from getting out." The bikers picked up the pace, but the tension was palpable. The building felt like a maze, and every turn could lead them directly into the path of their pursuers. "We're almost there," Jake said, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead. "Keep moving." The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the bikers' muscles tensed. They could feel the danger closing in around them. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a large, dimly lit room. In the center, a group of armed men stood, blocking the exit. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They were trapped. "Back up," Jake ordered, signaling the bikers to retreat into the shadows. They pressed themselves against the walls, trying to stay out of sight. The men in the room were speaking in low voices, but their presence made it clear they weren't there to negotiate. "They're waiting for us," Jake said, his mind working quickly. "We have no choice. We have to fight our way out." Diesel and the others nodded, their eyes focused, ready for the inevitable confrontation. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. The woman they had rescued wasn't just a random victim. This was more than a kidnapping. It was part of a bigger game. As the bikers prepared to charge, a voice called out from the back of the room. "Hold on." The man who spoke was tall, with graying hair and a hardened face that seemed to have seen it all. "I'm not here to fight you." Jake's eyes narrowed. He wasn't sure whether to trust this man or not, but he knew they didn't have time for hesitation. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his hand still gripping his weapon. The man stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "My name is Rick," he said. "I'm the one who sent the girl to you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "You're the one who—" "I know what you're thinking," Rick interrupted, his voice low and calm. "But I had to make sure someone would help her. She's not just anyone. She's the key to everything." Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What do you mean?" he asked, his grip tightening on his knife. "There's a lot you don't understand," Rick said. "This isn't just about a missing woman. This goes deeper than you think. The people after her, after all of you, have been watching for a long time." Jake's thoughts were spinning. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just a rescue mission. They had walked straight into something far more dangerous. "What do you want from us?" Jake asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. Rick's eyes darted to the woman they had rescued, still unconscious in Diesel's arms. "I need you to get her out of here," he said. "She's the only one who can stop this. But you'll need to be careful. They're watching. They'll stop at nothing to silence her." The room fell silent as the bikers exchanged looks, their minds racing to understand the full picture. But Jake knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let this woman fall into the wrong hands. "We're not backing down," Jake said firmly. "We'll get her out. But we need to know everything. Who's behind this? Why her?" Rick hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "She's not just a victim. She's been carrying something dangerous. Something that they want more than anything." The pieces were slowly falling into place, but Jake knew they didn't have much time. The danger was only escalating. "We don't have much time," Jake said, looking at his crew. "Get her to safety. Now." With that, the bikers moved quickly, making their way toward the exit, but not before they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. They were being followed. They weren't out of danger yet. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Jake's heart raced. They were still in the building, but the bikers had successfully moved the woman out of the dark room and into the narrow corridor. They had to keep moving. There was no time to waste. Every second brought them closer to danger. The walls of the old factory seemed to close in around them as they hurried toward the back exit, but Jake could hear the men closing in. They were being followed, and they weren't alone anymore. There was a sound behind them, footsteps echoing, a low murmur of voices. Jake's senses sharpened. He could feel the tension rise in the air, thick with anticipation. The group moved faster, adrenaline fueling their every step. "We've got to get to the bikes now," Jake muttered, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Diesel, carrying the unconscious woman, nodded without a word, his jaw clenched. The group, led by Jake, maneuvered quickly through the factory's winding halls. Their boots echoed in the quiet, a steady rhythm against the heavy silence that surrounded them. With each step, the sound of footsteps behind them grew closer. They were being tracked. The bikers needed to act fast. Just ahead, a light glowed dimly at the end of the corridor, and Jake knew it was their way out. The back exit. But as they neared it, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something felt wrong. The door was open, too open. "Stay alert," Jake hissed, his hand motioning for everyone to slow down. Something's not right. He moved toward the door cautiously, his eyes scanning every inch of the shadowy room ahead. The rest of the bikers followed, staying close, but their eyes flickered nervously toward the sound of voices now louder than ever. "We're surrounded," Diesel muttered under his breath, his grip on the woman tightening as he prepared for the worst. The woman still hadn't stirred, and Jake knew she needed medical attention. Fast. "Not yet," Jake said. "We're not letting them win." He stepped forward, a sudden feeling of urgency gripping his chest. His mind raced as the noise from outside the building increased. More footsteps. The bikers were close to making their escape, but something about the setup felt off. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine roared from the distance. A screech of tires. They were here. Jake's eyes locked with the other bikers, and they knew what was coming next. They had no choice. They would have to fight. Just as the first biker appeared in the doorway, rifle raised, Jake made his move. With lightning speed, he ducked, grabbing the first object he could reach, a rusty metal pipe lying on the ground. He swung it with force, knocking the weapon from the enemy's hands. The biker stumbled back in shock. "Move out. Now," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The bikers didn't hesitate. They surged forward, charging past Jake and pushing through the doorway, their eyes fixed on the street ahead. As they burst into the open air, Jake could hear the roar of engines getting closer. There was no time to waste. Diesel, still carrying the woman, sprinted toward the waiting motorcycles, and Jake followed, pulling out his gun as he ran. The sound of tires screeching echoed around them as several black SUVs skidded into view, blocking their path. The situation was about to get even worse. "We need to get through them," Jake said, his voice low and commanding. "Don't stop until you're on the bikes. We make a stand there." As the bikers reached their bikes, the engines roared to life with a deafening sound, filling the street. Jake glanced back at the enemy vehicles closing in behind them. There was no turning back now. The chase was on. The enemy wasn't just going to let them go. The fight was escalating, and Jake had no intention of losing. Diesel mounted his bike with the woman still slung over his shoulder, and Jake climbed onto his own bike, his heart pounding. The others followed suit, revving their engines and preparing for the fight ahead. The air was thick with tension as Jake signaled for everyone to go. The moment they started moving, the enemy came after them, their SUVs and motorcycles chasing them down the street. "Stay close," Jake barked, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We stick together. Don't let them split us up." The bikers weaved through traffic, speeding down the streets with engines roaring, trying to outrun the enemy's pursuit. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, trying to keep an eye on the approaching vehicles. They were gaining on them fast. "We need a plan," Diesel said, his voice tense over the comms. "They're not letting up." Jake's mind raced, calculating their next move. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed to get to a safe spot where they could fight back, a place they could use to their advantage. Head for the bridge up ahead, Jake ordered. We'll make our stand there. The bikers followed his lead, speeding toward the bridge. The enemy vehicles were still on their tail, but Jake knew this was their only chance. As they neared the bridge, Jake took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. They had to make a stand now or risk losing everything. It was all or nothing. The bikers weren't backing down. The roar of the motorcycles filled the night as Jake and the bikers sped toward the bridge. The enemy vehicles were closing in fast, their headlights blinding in the rearview mirrors. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars, his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced back, trying to judge the distance between them and the approaching SUVs. Diesel, still carrying the woman, stayed close behind, his eyes scanning the road ahead, knowing the group needed to make it to the bridge before the enemy closed in. The sound of tires screeching echoed from behind them as the enemy vehicles were gaining ground. The bikers pushed their bikes harder, weaving between traffic and taking sharp corners, trying to shake their pursuers. Jake's mind raced, thinking fast. The bridge was their only chance. They could make a stand there, use the narrow passageway to their advantage, but it would be risky. Almost there. Jake shouted over the comms, the wind howling in his ears. The bridge loomed ahead, its steel frame glinting under the streetlights. But just as they reached the entrance, the enemy came up fast from behind, blocking their only escape route. Jake's eyes locked onto the approaching vehicles, calculating their next move. They didn't have much time. They had to act now. Stop, Jake shouted, pulling on the brakes. The bikers skidded to a halt just in time, the roar of their engines echoing off the bridge's pillars. The enemy vehicles stopped too, but they weren't backing down. The moment of truth had arrived. Jake quickly dismounted his bike, his eyes scanning the road ahead, calculating the distance between them and their attackers. The woman they had rescued was still unconscious, but they couldn't afford to worry about that now. Get ready, Jake ordered, his voice low and steady. We're making our stand here. Diesel, still holding the woman, nodded grimly. The rest of the bikers followed suit, dismounting their bikes and spreading out in a defensive formation. The enemy had no intention of leaving them alone. Jake could feel the tension building in the air. They were about to face off, and there was no way out. The enemy stepped out of their vehicles, each one of them armed and ready for a fight. Jake's eyes flicked to the woman, still unconscious in Diesel's arms. She was their only hope, but getting her to safety was looking less and less likely. We don't have much time, Diesel muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the enemy, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about protecting the woman anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't fight back now, they'd be overrun. Jake's muscles tensed as he glanced at the rest of the bikers, each one of them ready for a fight. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise on their side. The enemy didn't know what they were up against. Jake stepped forward, his hand on his knife, his eyes locked on the enemy leader. You're not taking her, Jake growled, his voice full of authority. The leader of the enemy group smirked, stepping closer, his weapon raised. You think you can stop us? He sneered. You're nothing but a bunch of lowlifes. You can't win this fight. Jake's grip tightened on his knife, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. We'll see about that, he said, his voice cold. The first move came quickly. The enemy charged, weapons drawn, but Jake was faster. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the moonlight as he sliced through the air. A grunt of pain escaped one of the attackers as he staggered back, clutching his side. The bikers were right behind Jake, moving quickly, expertly, their fists and blades finding their targets. It was chaos. The sound of grunts, punches, and clashing weapons filled the air as the bikers fought with everything they had. Jake's mind was focused, his movements precise as he took down one enemy after another. The rest of the bikers followed his lead, their training and experience making them a formidable force. Despite their strength, the enemy wasn't backing down. They fought back with the same intensity, their numbers overwhelming, but Jake and his crew were determined. They weren't going to let the woman fall back into their hands. For every attack that came their way, the bikers responded with greater force, pushing the enemies back. Jake's heart raced as he saw one of the attackers trying to break through to the woman. Without thinking, he dashed forward, knocking the man to the ground with a swift punch. The rest of the bikers continued to push back, forcing the enemy to retreat. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and adrenaline. Jake's body was covered in bruises, but he didn't feel the pain. The only thing that mattered was protecting the woman. As the last of the enemy retreated, Jake stood panting, his chest heaving. The bikers stood in a defensive circle around the woman, their eyes scanning the area for any more threats. "Is everyone okay?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Diesel nodded, his expression grim as he looked down at the woman in his arms. "She's still out cold," he said. "But we've got her." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had won this fight, but he knew it wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead of them, and the danger wasn't far behind. The bikers weren't out of the woods yet. But for now, they had done what they came for. They had fought, and they had won. The woman was safe, at least for now. The bridge was quiet now, the echo of the fight slowly fading into the distance as the bikers regrouped. They had fought hard, and while they had successfully defended themselves, they knew this was far from over. The woman was still unconscious, her fragile form resting in Diesel's arms. Jake could see the tension in the air, the exhaustion written across everyone's faces. But there was something else there, too, a sense of urgency. The fight wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "We need to move. Now," Jake said, his voice firm. He turned toward Diesel. "How is she?" Diesel adjusted his grip on the woman, his face grim. "She's still out cold. No sign of serious injury, but we need to get her somewhere safe, fast." Jake nodded. They couldn't afford to wait. They had barely escaped the ambush, and now they needed to get her to safety before the enemy regrouped and came after them again. "All right," Jake said, his eyes scanning the area, making sure they weren't being followed. "We'll head to the warehouse. It's secure there for now." The bikers mounted their bikes and revved their engines, ready to leave the bridge behind and head toward their next destination. As they roared out onto the open road, the sound of their engines was deafening. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The enemy wasn't finished with them yet. They had made it this far, but Jake knew they were only one step ahead. The warehouse was a few miles away, but the ride felt longer. Every street they passed, every turn, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. It was as if danger was closing in on them from all sides. "Keep your heads on a swivel," Jake warned, his voice steady but tense. "We don't know if they've got eyes on us, but I'm betting they do." The bikers tightened their formation, staying close together as they made their way down the empty streets. The wind whipped past them, and Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts kept racing. Who were these people after the woman? Why had they gone to such lengths to capture her? What was it that made her so important? He couldn't answer those questions yet, but he knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. As they approached the warehouse, Jake felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was the only place they could afford to lay low for the time being. The building was old, a relic from a past time, but it was solid, with high walls and a few hidden entrances. The bikers pulled into the large parking lot, their bikes echoing against the concrete. Jake motioned for everyone to stay alert. "We'll move quickly, get her inside, and make sure no one sees us." They moved swiftly, entering through the side door, the woman still in Diesel's arms. The rest of the bikers followed, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, making sure they weren't being followed. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was cold and dark, the only light coming from a few overhead bulbs that flickered sporadically. The group gathered in the center, their faces tense as they set the woman down on an old couch that was covered in dust. Diesel crouched beside her, checking her vitals once more. "She's stable," he said, though his voice was laced with concern. "But she needs medical attention. Soon." Jake nodded. The woman had survived the worst, but the real danger was yet to come. As he looked around at the bikers, he saw the same worry reflected in their eyes. They knew they were in for a fight. The woman's condition wasn't the only thing on their minds. The enemy would be looking for them, and they wouldn't stop until they found them. The next few hours felt like an eternity. The bikers took turns keeping watch, their senses heightened as they waited for the inevitable. Jake stayed by the woman's side, trying to figure out what their next move would be. They couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, they'd need to leave. But where could they go? The silence in the warehouse was broken only by the sound of distant cars passing by outside. It felt as though the world had come to a standstill. But Jake couldn't afford to relax. He knew the enemy was still out there, hunting them down. And with each passing minute, they were getting closer. "We can't stay here much longer," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. "They'll find us eventually." Diesel, who had been watching the woman, nodded. "I know, but we're not leaving without her. We made a promise." Jake looked at Diesel, his eyes hard with determination. "I know," he said, "and we'll keep that promise. But we need a plan." The bikers huddled together, their minds focused on their next move. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Time was running out. They had to figure out where the enemy would strike next and how to stay one step ahead. As the hours passed and the woman showed no signs of waking, Jake knew they had no choice but to take action. It was time to face the danger head-on, no matter what it took. The tension in the warehouse was unbearable as the bikers gathered in a tight circle, trying to come up with a plan. The woman, still unconscious, lay on the dusty couch, her shallow breathing the only sign that she was still alive. Diesel was by her side, constantly monitoring her condition, but it was clear that they needed help, medical help, and fast. Jake paced back and forth, his mind racing as he considered their next move. The enemy wouldn't be far behind. The bikers had made it to the warehouse. For now, but how long would it be before they found them? He looked over at the rest of the group, their eyes filled with the same fear, the same sense of urgency. They knew they couldn't hide forever. "We need to get her to a doctor," Jake said, his voice rough with frustration. "She can't survive like this for long. We don't have the supplies we need here." Diesel nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but the moment we leave this place, we risk exposing ourselves." Jake paused, considering Diesel's words. He knew the risk was enormous, but they couldn't afford to wait around, hoping the woman would wake up on her own. Time was running out. "We don't have a choice," Jake said finally. "We're going to have to move her, but we need a plan." The room fell silent as the bikers exchanged glances. They knew they couldn't simply rush out into the open without drawing attention to themselves. The enemy was still out there, and if they weren't careful, they'd walk right into a trap. "We'll go at night," Jake continued, his voice steady. "Under the cover of darkness, we'll get her to a safe house we know. It's the best chance we have." Diesel stood up, his face set in determination. "All right, we'll do it your way. But we need to keep moving fast. If they're tracking us, we can't afford to stop." Jake looked at the group, his eyes hard with resolve. "We move out in 2 hours. Get ready. We'll leave everything behind here. No trace." The bikers nodded, preparing for the dangerous trek ahead. They weren't used to running, but they had no other option. With their bikes fueled and ready, they gathered their gear and made sure the woman was secured in the safest position possible. Diesel carefully lifted her, cradling her in his arms as they made their way to the bikes. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning the area, ever vigilant for any sign of danger. As they left the warehouse, the air felt different. The stillness of the night pressed against them, broken only by the sound of their engines rumbling to life. They moved quickly, staying close together, but Jake's mind kept racing. The enemy had been relentless so far. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, and right now, that was the woman. In their arms. The group navigated the streets, taking detours to avoid being seen. Jake's heart pounded as they made their way through the darkened city, their headlights cutting through the gloom. Every corner, every alley could be hiding a threat. "Stay sharp," Jake ordered, his voice tense. They could be anywhere. The bikers followed his lead, moving swiftly but cautiously. They knew the risk, but they also knew that the woman's life depended on them. It was as if the weight of the world was on their shoulders. The farther they got from the warehouse, the more Jake's anxiety grew. They couldn't afford any mistakes. They couldn't afford to be caught. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the safe house, a secluded building on the outskirts of town. The area was quiet, the streets empty, and for the first time since they'd left the warehouse, Jake felt a small sense of relief. They had made it, but it was only temporary. The danger was far from over. As they entered the house, Diesel gently placed the woman on the couch. He took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "She needs help," he said, his voice strained. "And fast." Jake nodded, pacing the room as he considered their next move. They were safe for now, but they couldn't hide here forever. The enemy would eventually catch up, and when they did, it would be a fight for their lives. "We need to get her to the doctor tomorrow," Jake said. "No more delays. We'll figure out the next step then." Diesel nodded. "I'll stay with her tonight. Make sure she's okay. Jake looked at the rest of the bikers. Everyone else, keep watch. Don't let anyone get too close. They all nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The next few hours were tense, with everyone staying alert and watching for any signs of danger. Jake sat on a chair by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside, knowing that at any moment, their enemies could find them. The woman's condition weighed heavily on his mind, but he knew they had done all they could for now. There was no turning back. The fight was far from over, and they were about to face a battle unlike any they had encountered before. The night was quiet, but the silence felt heavy, like the calm before the storm. Jake sat by the window of the safe house, his eyes scanning the street outside. The faint sound of crickets was the only noise breaking the stillness, but his senses were on high alert. Diesel was still watching over the woman, making sure she was stable for the moment. But Jake knew that they couldn't stay here forever. The enemy was relentless, and sooner or later, they'd find them. The question wasn't if, but when. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The promise he had made to protect the woman and the little girl. It was his job to make sure they stayed safe, no matter what it took. But as the hours ticked by, Jake's nerves began to fray. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every passing car a potential danger. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to come up with a plan to keep them one step ahead. Diesel walked over, his face lined with exhaustion but determination in his eyes. She's stable for now, he said, his voice low. But we need to get her help. I don't know how long she can hold on like this. Jake nodded. I know. Tomorrow we'll get her to a doctor. But we need to keep our guard up. I don't trust that we're safe here. Diesel sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not just her I'm worried about, he said. It's the girl. She's the one they really want. The woman's just the key. Jake's mind raced as he thought back to the little girl, the one who had led them here in the first place. She was scared, vulnerable, but there was something about her that had drawn Jake in. She wasn't just any child. There was something more to her story, something important. And that was why the enemy was so determined to get her. They were close, he could feel it. But what did they want from her? Jake couldn't help but wonder if they even knew what they were after. The woman had been carrying something that made her a target. But what if the little girl had something even more powerful? Something that the enemy would stop at nothing to get? The sound of the door creaking open broke Jake's train of thought. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but it was only one of the bikers, Tanner, a quiet but reliable member of the crew. Got something for you, Tanner said, holding up a small piece of paper. Jake took it from him, unfolding it with care. It was a map, marking a location just outside the city. Tanner's eyes were dark, his voice low. It's where they're keeping the woman's husband. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The woman had been on the run, and now they had learned that her husband was being held by the same people who were after her. If they were going to save the woman and the little girl, they would have to act fast. But the location Tanner had given them was far from safe. It was deep in enemy territory, a place that would require all their strength and skill to navigate. We leave at dawn, Jake said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. The rest of the bikers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The plan was set, but the danger was high. They were walking straight into the lion's den, and the odds were stacked against them. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with thoughts of the woman, her husband, and the little girl. He couldn't let them down. He wouldn't. But as dawn approached, a sudden realization hit him. They were not just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for something bigger. The enemy wasn't just trying to silence the woman or take the girl. They were trying to control something. Something that could change everything. Jake's grip tightened around the handle of his bike, the cold steel grounding him in the present. They were about to make their move, and there was no turning back now. The group gathered by their bikes, ready for what was ahead. Diesel helped the woman onto his bike, making sure she was secure. The rest of the bikers mounted their own motorcycles, their engines roaring to life as they prepared to hit the road. The sun had barely risen when they pulled out of the safe house, the cold morning air rushing past them. Jake took the lead, his eyes scanning the road ahead, staying focused on the mission. They couldn't afford any mistakes. As they drove, Jake kept his mind sharp. The road to the enemy's stronghold was dangerous, but they had no choice. They were close, so close, to uncovering the truth. And with every mile, the stakes grew higher. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they knew one thing for sure. The time to fight was now. The sun had barely risen when Jake and the bikers pulled out of the safe house, their engines roaring to life as they headed toward the enemy's stronghold. The air was still cool, the quiet of the morning broken only by the sound of their motorcycles. Jake led the group, his focus unwavering, his mind racing with the knowledge of what was ahead. The road stretched out before them, but every mile felt heavier, the weight of the mission pressing on him. Diesel, who had the woman on his bike, stayed close behind Jake, his expression hard as he glanced at the woman, still unconscious, but alive. The rest of the bikers formed up, keeping a close formation, but the distance between them and the enemy's location was closing in fast. They didn't have time to waste, but Jake knew every second counted. He had no idea what awaited them when they got there, but he was sure of one thing. They weren't going to stop until they had answers. "Stay sharp," Jake said over the comms, his voice low but urgent. "We make it through this, we get the truth. But no matter what, we protect the woman and the girl. That's the only thing that matters now." Diesel grunted in acknowledgement, his grip tightening on the handlebars. The road they were on was winding, cutting through dense woods, and every turn felt like they were getting closer to something dark and dangerous. The air around them seemed to thicken, and even the bikers, seasoned as they were, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Jake glanced over his shoulder, but he saw nothing. The path ahead was clear, but he wasn't fooled. He knew the enemy had eyes everywhere. They had to be close. It was a calculated risk to keep moving forward, but there was no turning back now. They could feel the tension rising, the anxiety building up in their chests, but they couldn't afford to show it. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to let fear stop them. As they neared the outskirts of the enemy's stronghold, Jake could see the silhouette of a large building ahead, its shape emerging from the thick fog. The motorcycles cut through the quiet, their engines low and steady as they approached their destination. The enemy was waiting. Jake's eyes narrowed as they got closer. "This is it," he said quietly. "We're not turning back." He revved his bike and accelerated, the rest of the bikers following in formation. The sound of the engines grew louder, and the buildings ahead loomed larger. They were close, so close, but Jake could feel the weight of the moment. This was what they had been riding toward, but now, standing on the edge of this unknown, there was a small knot of doubt in his stomach. The building ahead was dark, and as they got closer, Jake saw the lights flicker inside, a sign that the place was occupied. The place was crawling with enemies. Jake signaled for the bikers to slow down and pull into the shadows. The plan was to strike quickly, but they needed to assess the situation first. They parked their bikes in a dark corner, their engines quieting as they slid off, keeping low. Jake motioned for the group to spread out, signaling each biker to take up their position. Diesel stayed close, the woman still cradled in his arms. Jake's eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of the enemy. The closer they got, the more Jake could feel his pulse quicken. They were close to finding out everything, but they needed to be careful. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. They made their way toward the building, staying low to the ground, their steps silent in the thick underbrush. The place was heavily guarded, Jake could tell. He could see the shadows of figures moving inside, patrolling the area, making sure no one snuck in unnoticed. Jake's mind raced as he thought of the best way to infiltrate. He wasn't about to rush in blindly, but they couldn't waste time either. They had to strike when the opportunity presented itself. As they reached the outer perimeter of the building, Jake signaled for everyone to stop. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'll go in first. Keep your eyes on the lookout. If things go south, we're getting out fast." No hesitation. The bikers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Jake moved forward, his footsteps steady as he crept toward the building. He could feel the eyes of the others on him, but he didn't turn back. He had to get inside. The darkness seemed to swallow him as he approached the door, the faint hum of the building's lights the only sound breaking the silence. He tried the handle locked. Of course, he'd expected that. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a small tool, quickly working the lock until he heard the satisfying click. The door creaked open, and Jake slipped inside. The interior of the building was dark and cold, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the space for any sign of movement. His heart raced, but his mind was focused. He had to find answers. He had to get the woman's husband, get the girl to safety, and stop whatever was happening inside this building. As Jake made his way deeper into the building, he suddenly heard voices ahead. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he crouched down behind a stack of crates, holding his breath. He could hear footsteps approaching. The enemy was close. He couldn't afford to be seen. Not now. Jake waited, his body tensed, his hand on his weapon, knowing that this was the moment everything could change. Jake crouched low, his back pressed against the cold metal of the crates, his breath shallow as he waited for the footsteps to pass. The sound of the approaching guards grew louder, the shuffle of boots against concrete echoing through the building's silence. Every second felt like an eternity. His grip on his weapon tightened as his mind raced through possible scenarios, calculating the risk of making a move. The voices of the guards were low, unintelligible, but Jake could tell they were getting closer. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard. He had to act fast. As the footsteps approached the corner, Jake made his move. With a swift motion, he pushed himself off the crates, moving like a shadow through the darkness. He reached the door just as the guards passed, their figures barely visible in the dim light. Holding his breath, Jake slipped through the narrow opening, careful not to make a sound. He was in. Inside, the building was eerily quiet, the only noise coming from the low hum of machinery in the background. Jake's eyes scanned the room quickly. It was a large, open area with tall stacks of crates and metal shelves lined with various equipment. There were no windows, only overhead lights that flickered intermittently. He had no idea how many people were inside, but he wasn't about to wait around to find out. His objective was clear: find the woman's husband and get out. He moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, listening for any sign of movement. The place felt abandoned, almost too quiet. The tension in the air was thick, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of machinery. He could feel his pulse quickening as he moved deeper into the building, each step bringing him closer to the heart of the operation. After a few minutes of creeping through the aisles, Jake spotted a hallway leading off to the right. There were no guards in sight, and the hallway seemed to be the most direct route to the back of the building. He moved toward it, his body tense, every sense on high alert. As he turned the corner into the hallway, he froze. A door at the far end of the corridor was slightly ajar, a soft light spilling out from the crack. He didn't need to guess what was behind that door. It had to be where they were keeping the woman's husband. He moved toward it slowly, his footsteps barely audible on the concrete floor. His heart raced in his chest, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. When he reached the door, he paused, pressing his ear against the wood, listening for any sounds coming from the other side. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint noise, muffled voices. They were talking, but he couldn't make out the words. Jake didn't wait any longer. He pushed the door open slowly, his eyes darting around the small room as he stepped inside. There, in the corner of the room, sat the woman's husband, his hands bound to a chair. His face was bruised, but he was alive. Jake moved quickly, crossing the room in 3 long strides, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. He cut through the ropes that bound the man's wrists, the knife slicing through the fibers with ease. "You're safe now," Jake said quietly, his voice low but reassuring. The man looked up, his eyes filled with surprise and fear. "Who are you?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. "I'm here to get you out," Jake replied, glancing quickly over his shoulder toward the door. "We don't have much time. They'll be looking for you." The man nodded, still weak from his captivity, but he managed to stand on shaky legs. Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Jake didn't respond. He was already moving, pulling the man toward the door. As they stepped back into the hallway, Jake motioned for him to be quiet. They had to move quickly. They were in enemy territory now, and every second counted. They made it back to the main room of the building without incident, but just as they reached the exit, Jake heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The guards were closing in. He turned to the man, his voice urgent. "Stay low, follow me, and don't make a sound." The man nodded, his face pale with fear, but he followed Jake as they ducked behind a stack of crates. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. They couldn't afford to be caught now. The door to the building was within reach, but they had to get through the guards first. He peered around the crate, watching as the 2 guards passed by, their attention focused elsewhere. The moment they were out of sight, Jake signaled for the man to follow. They moved quickly, slipping past the guards and out into the night. The cold air hit them like a wave, but there was no time to pause. The sound of the motorcycles outside was their only reassurance. They had made it. But the danger wasn't over yet. Jake pushed the man toward the bikes, Diesel already waiting with the woman. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice sharp, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. The group mounted their bikes, and with a roar of engines, they sped off into the night, their hearts still racing from the close call. They had rescued the woman's husband, but the real fight was just beginning. The enemy would come for them, and when they did, they'd have to be ready. Jake wasn't about to let anything stop them now. The engines roared. As Jake and the bikers sped through the darkened streets, the night air cold and biting against their faces. Their mission was far from over. They had rescued the woman's husband, but now they had to deal with the aftermath. Every mile that passed felt like an eternity, but Jake couldn't afford to let his guard down. They were deep in enemy territory, and he knew they would be hunting them down soon enough. The bikes zipped through the empty streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness, guiding the way. Diesel was riding close behind, still carrying the unconscious woman, while the rest of the bikers formed up in tight formation. Jake's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning for any signs of pursuit. He couldn't see anything yet, but he knew the enemy wasn't far behind. He glanced at the man they had just rescued. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "We're not out of the woods yet," Jake said, his voice steady, but the weight of the situation pressing on him. "We need to get to the safe house and lay low for a while. No stops until we're there." The man nodded, his grip on his own bike tightening as he tried to keep up with the group. "I understand," he muttered. Jake turned his attention back to the road ahead. His mind was racing, his heart pounding. There were so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that still didn't fit. What did the enemy want with the woman and her family? Why were they so determined to track them down? Jake had his theories, but he needed to find the truth. He needed answers, and fast. The group rode on, the tension growing with every passing minute. The sound of their bikes was deafening, but it did little to drown out the noise in Jake's head. He couldn't help but think about the little girl. She had been so scared, so vulnerable when they first found her, but there was something about her that didn't sit right. Something about the way she had acted, the way she had led them here, made Jake think there was more to this story than anyone realized. The safe house was a few miles ahead, nestled in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't much, but it was all they had for now. Jake didn't care about comfort. All that mattered was that it was secure. As they approached, Jake signaled for the group to slow down, making sure there were no signs of anyone waiting for them. He didn't want to take any chances. They had been lucky so far, but luck wouldn't keep them safe forever. The safe house was an old, run-down building with a high fence and a few windows, but the walls were thick, and the door was solid. It was the best place they could afford to hide for now. The bikers dismounted, their movements sharp and efficient, the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Diesel carefully helped the woman off his bike, cradling her in his arms as they made their way to the door. The rest of the bikers stood guard, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Jake motioned for everyone to follow him as they moved inside. The woman's husband was the last to enter, his face still pale from the ordeal, but he was breathing easier now. Inside the house, it was dark and quiet. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Jake quickly checked all the windows, making sure they were secure before turning to the group. "We've got a few hours before we need to make our next move," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "We need to stay alert. This place won't protect us forever." Diesel nodded, his face serious. "What's the next step?" Jake's mind raced as he thought about their options. They couldn't stay here for long, but they needed to get their bearings first. "We need to lay low, regroup, and figure out our next move. The enemy is close, but we can't afford to be reckless. We wait until tomorrow, then we get out of here." The bikers all nodded in agreement, but the tension in the air was palpable. The next few hours were critical. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The woman and her husband sat on the couch, both exhausted but grateful. The little girl, still silent, sat next to them, her wide eyes scanning the room. Jake couldn't help but notice how quiet she was. She had barely spoken since they rescued her, and Jake wondered if there was more to her story than she was letting on. Diesel, sensing Jake's concern, leaned over. She's been through a lot. Give her time. Jake nodded, but his instincts were telling him something was off. He knew there was more to this girl, something hidden beneath the surface. But for now, he had to focus on the task at hand. The safe house wasn't a permanent solution, and they couldn't stay here forever. Jake paced the room, his thoughts running wild. We can't wait too long, he muttered to himself. They'll find us. He looked over at the rest of the bikers, who were standing guard at the door and windows. Stay sharp, he warned. We can't afford to get careless. The hours passed slowly, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. Jake knew they were running out of time. The enemy would be looking for them, and when they found them, they would stop at nothing to take what they wanted. But Jake wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. The quiet of the safe house was shattered by the distant sound of engines approaching. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he looked out the window, the same uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't sure if it was just the tension of the moment or if something was off, but he could feel the danger getting closer. The enemy wasn't going to give up, not now. He turned to the group, his eyes meeting Diesel's as they both understood the weight of the situation. The moment of peace they had found was about to end. Get ready, Jake said in a low voice, his tone sharp and urgent. They're coming. We don't have much time. The room instantly shifted, the bikers moving quickly and efficiently to prepare for what was to come. Diesel was already by the woman's side, making sure she was secure and still unconscious, while the rest of the group positioned themselves near the windows and doors, ready for a fight. Jake moved to the door, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the street outside. It was only a matter of time before the enemy closed in, and they needed to make a decision. Escape or face them head-on. The decision was made quickly. We're not running. We've fought for too long to back down now. We'll hold our ground. The rest of the bikers nodded, their faces hardening with determination. They had fought through too much to be intimidated now. They had to protect the woman, the girl, and each other. Jake's mind raced with strategies as he moved to the back of the house. He knew the enemy would be coming in force, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He turned to the group one last time. Stay together. Watch each other's backs. We're in this together, no matter what happens. The engines grew louder as the enemy's vehicles neared. Jake could hear the screeching tires as they skidded to a stop. This was it. The moment of truth. The bikers braced themselves, ready for the fight. Jake knew they weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were defending the lives of everyone in that room. The front door burst open with a violent crash, and Jake's heart raced as he saw the enemy charging in. They were armed, their eyes cold and determined. But Jake wasn't intimidated. He had seen this kind of thing before, and he knew how to fight. Let's go, Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos as he drew his weapon and moved forward. The bikers followed, their weapons drawn and ready. The clash was brutal. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the room as the bikers fought to keep the enemy at bay. Jake's eyes darted around, looking for any advantage. The building wasn't big, and there was nowhere to run. But they had the element of surprise. They had the advantage of knowing the layout, knowing where the exits were, and how to use the space to their advantage. Diesel was by his side, pushing forward with a fierce determination, while the rest of the bikers kept the enemy from surrounding them. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but he didn't let it show. He had a job to do, and he was going to see it through. The fight raged on, but Jake could feel the tide beginning to turn. The enemy was starting to retreat, their numbers thinning as the bikers pushed forward. It wasn't over yet, but Jake knew they had won this battle. The woman's husband was safe. The little girl was safe, and they were all still standing. But Jake knew that this victory came at a price. The enemy would be back. They wouldn't give up that easily. The bikers stood together, breathing heavily, their eyes scanning the room for any more threats. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and blood, but Jake couldn't afford to relax just yet. They had to leave fast. Let's move, Jake ordered, his voice low but urgent. The bikers quickly regrouped, making sure the woman and the girl were safe. They couldn't afford to stay in one place too long. The enemy was still out there, and they knew that they couldn't let their guard down. The group moved quickly, heading for the back exit. The woman was still unconscious, but they couldn't waste time waiting for her to wake up. They had to get out before the enemy could regroup and come after them again. As they made their way through the back alleys, Jake glanced over at Diesel, who was holding the woman tightly. "We made it through this," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Diesel nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of what was still to come. "I know, but we'll keep going. We always do." The group moved quickly, staying close together, but there was no time to relax. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep protecting each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had made it this far. And as long as they were together, Jake knew they could face whatever came next. In this thrilling tale of survival, mystery, and danger, the Hell Angels stories unfold as a group of bikers face a relentless pursuit to protect an innocent family. When a little girl leads them to her dying mother, the bikers, led by Jake, must navigate dangerous territories, uncover hidden truths, and fight to stay one step ahead of a merciless enemy. With every twist and turn, the stakes are higher, and the bikers must rely on their loyalty and grit to survive. From high-speed chases to intense confrontations, these Hell Angels stories delve into the dark and gritty world of those who live on the edge. As they uncover more about the woman and her family's mysterious past, the bikers find themselves fighting not just for survival, but for the truth. The tension mounts. With each passing moment as the bikers make their stand against powerful enemies, risking it all in this high-octane, action-packed journey. With the fate of the woman's family hanging in the balance, these Hell Angels stories show the lengths one will go to for loyalty, justice, and protection. Join the ride through this intense narrative of courage, betrayal, and survival, where the bikers' bonds are tested to their limits. As secrets unravel and danger closes in, the Hell Angels stories reveal the true cost of standing up against overwhelming odds. Get ready for an unforgettable ride filled with suspense, twists, and the relentless pursuit of justice. These Hell Angels stories are just beginning, and the bikers are prepared to face whatever comes next.